The Duke's Return, England, 1814, Halcourt Manor, Somersetshire. She had made a home in his absence. He had returned with nothing but war behind him, and found her light in every room. She thought the manor was abandoned. She had no idea who owned it, or that he was coming back. Thaddeus Halcourt, Duke of Ashcroft, returned from the Peninsular War, a changed man, scarred, silent, unrecognizable even to himself. He expected to find his estate cold and empty. Instead, he found fire in the hearth, roses on the windowsills, and a woman, bold, beautiful, and entirely too comfortable in his drawing room, who had no earthly idea she was standing in the home of one of England's most powerful dukes. What begins as an impossible situation becomes something neither of them is prepared to survive. Stay with us, subscribe, and tell us, where are you watching from? The carriage moved slowly through the grey afternoon, wheels grinding against gravel that had not been tended in 3 years. Thaddeus Halcourt said nothing. He had not said much since the war ended, since the smoke and the screaming and the particular silence that follows cannon fire. That terrible, suspended quiet when a man cannot tell if he is still alive or merely refusing to die. He sat with one hand resting on the window ledge, watching the familiar hills of Somersetshire roll past in the muted April light, and felt nothing that resembled homecoming. He had expected that. What he had not expected was the smoke, not the smoke of ruin. He had prepared himself for that, for the grey skeleton of a neglected estate, for broken shutters and ivy that had crept through the window frames in his absence. He had made peace with decay. He had, in some dark corner of himself, almost welcomed it. A crumbling house for a crumbling man. Symmetry, if nothing else. But this smoke was different. It curled from the main chimney in a thin domestic ribbon, pale against the pewter sky, unhurried, the kind of smoke that meant someone had laid a fire that morning and expected to need it that evening. His jaw tightened. His eyes did not leave it. "Someone is inside," he said, to no one in particular. His man, Graves, who had survived Salamanca, Badajoz, and 4 years of his master's silences, simply nodded. "So it appears, Your Grace." The carriage halted at the front steps. Thaddeus descended before Graves could open the door, and he stood for a moment on the gravel, looking up at the face of Halcourt Manor. It looked alive. That was the only word that came to him, and it unsettled him more than ruins would have. The windows were clean, both of them, all of them actually. He counted along the facade with the involuntary steadiness a soldier develops when it becomes necessary to count things in order to remain calm. Every window, clean. The stone steps had been swept. A climbing rose, one he did not remember planting, ran along the eastern wall, its first green shoots already reaching toward the upper sill. A pot of something earthy and purple sat beside the front door. He stared at the pot, the whole peninsula behind him, and someone had placed a pot of lavender at his door. He moved up the steps, pushed open the unlocked door, unlocked, another detail that registered like a small deliberate alarm, and entered the hall. The smell hit him first. Beeswax, dried herbs, something warm and faintly sweet coming from the direction of the kitchen, bread perhaps, or a tart. Beneath it all, the familiar old stone smell of the manor itself, but softened now, layered over with the unmistakable evidence of habitation, of care. The hall had been cleaned. The floors gleamed with a dull, honest polish. The portraits of his ancestors, those stern Halcourt men who had looked disapprovingly at him since childhood, had been dusted, and one of them, the third Duke, had been straightened. It had hung crooked for as long as Thaddeus could remember. His father had never bothered. He had never bothered. Someone had bothered. He heard her before he saw her, a voice, low, melodic, talking to itself with the easy confidence of someone completely alone and quite comfortable that way. She was reading aloud, he realized, from somewhere above, the first landing, or just beyond it. The words were indistinct, but the rhythm was unmistakable. A woman reading to herself on a Tuesday afternoon in his house, in a voice that suggested she found it entirely reasonable to do so. He climbed the stairs. She was in the library. She stood at the far window with a book open in her hands, her back to him, dressed in a pale muslin morning gown that the afternoon light turned nearly translucent at the hem. Her dark hair was half pinned, half escaped, the kind of arrangement that had started tidy and been thoroughly abandoned by noon. She was reading in that particular posture of someone deeply absorbed. Weight shifted to one hip, chin slightly down, one hand holding the book and the other pressed flat against the window glass as if she needed to feel something solid while she travelled somewhere else entirely. Thaddeus stopped in the doorway. He did not speak. He was aware in some detached and clinical way that he should speak. He should announce himself. He should inform this woman, this thoroughly uninvited, entirely too comfortable woman, that she was standing in the private library of the Duke of Ashcroft, reading his books in his house without his permission, and that she ought to explain herself immediately. He did not say any of that. He stood in the doorway of his library and watched a stranger read, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could account for, the specific, dangerous sensation of being curious about something. She turned a page. "The passage about the sea," she murmured to herself, "is the only honest thing in the entire chapter." A short, private laugh. Foolish man. He must have made some sound, shifted his weight, exhaled, because she stiffened. Slowly, very slowly, she closed the book, turned. She saw him. For one long moment neither of them moved. Her eyes were dark, almost black in the afternoon light, and they moved over him with an unhurried thoroughness that surprised him. Not the quick, frightened scan of someone caught trespassing. Something more measured, more poised, as if she was taking stock of a situation and had not yet decided what it required of her. Then her chin lifted. "So you startled me," she said, in a tone that suggested she found this mildly inconvenient rather than alarming. "This is my library," he replied. A pause. The kind of pause that a very self-possessed person uses when they are rapidly recalculating. "I beg your pardon." "This," said Thaddeus Halcourt, Duke of Ashcroft, in the flattest voice the years of war had left him, "is my library, in my house, which I am given to understand you have been occupying in my absence." He watched the colour change in her face. Not quite a flush, not quite pallor, but something caught precisely between the two. Her grip on the book tightened. The knuckles of her right hand went white, but she did not look away. "Your house," she said quietly. "Yes." Another pause. Something moved behind her eyes, swift and private, too quick for him to name. "You are the Duke." "I am." The book lowered slowly to her side. She drew one very controlled breath. "I," said Christiana Oakhurst, with the specific dignity of a woman who has made a terrible error and refuses to collapse under the weight of it, "was not informed the estate had an owner in residence." "It did not," he said, "until today." The silence between them was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that has sharp edges. Christiana held his gaze for 3 full seconds. He counted because he still counted things, and then dipped into a curtsy, so measured it was almost aggressive. "Your Grace," she said. The fire crackled in the grate behind her. He had not lit that fire. She had. She told him everything, quickly, efficiently, with the straightforward steadiness of someone who had learned that the worst outcomes usually came to people who hesitated. Her name was Christiana Oakhurst. Her father, the late Sir Edmund Oakhurst, had held a minor baronetcy in the neighbouring county of Dorset. When he died 18 months ago, the estate had passed, as such things invariably and cruelly did, to a male cousin she had met twice, who had wasted no time in making clear that her continued residence was neither required nor desired. She had written to her father's solicitor, a Mr. Prentice of Bath, who had informed her, with the bureaucratic cheerfulness of a man delivering catastrophe by letter, that Halcourt Manor had been placed in a kind of informal stewardship arrangement during the Duke's absence. The estate staff had long since dispersed. The house required someone to prevent the kind of irreversible decline that afflicted neglected properties in the English countryside. Mr. Prentice had offered her the position of caretaker, with modest compensation and the use of a room. She had taken the use of 5 rooms because the house was large and she was practical. Thaddeus listened to all of this from the chair by the window. His chair, though she had clearly been using it, there was a book on the side table and a cup of cold tea that he had not made, and said nothing until she finished. 5 rooms, he said. "The east wing," she said without apology. "The dampness in the west wing made it uninhabitable. I had the chimneys in the east cleared last autumn. 2 were severely blocked, which was, I suspect, why the previous occupants left so hastily. A fire hazard, frankly. You cleared the chimneys. I arranged for them to be cleared. There is a difference. She paused. I also had the kitchen garden replanted. The original beds were entirely overgrown, and the library required considerable reorganization. Your predecessor's cataloguing system was, with respect, incomprehensible. She said this last part with the restraint of someone who has very strong opinions about cataloguing systems and is exercising admirable self-control in not expressing them fully. Something happened in Thaddeus's chest. Not warmth. He did not think he was capable of warmth yet. The months of war had burned that register out of him for the time being. But something adjacent to it. A flicker of something he couldn't quite name. He looked at her properly for the first time. She was perhaps 23, dark-eyed, as he had noted in the library, with the kind of face that arranged itself in stillness when she was thinking, not cold, but poised in the way that suggested she had chosen that quality deliberately, over time, as a method of survival. There was intelligence in the set of her mouth. There was something else, too, a quality he could not yet name, something watchful and undeceived and quietly iron-willed. She was watching him the same way he was watching her. He found, to his faint irritation, that he did not mind. Mr. Prentice, he said at last, neglected to mention any of this in his correspondence. Mr. Prentice, she said with measured neutrality, neglects a great many things. Evidently. He looked at the fire, her fire, built in his grate. Where do you intend to go? A very slight pause, just enough to tell him that she had asked herself this question and had not arrived at an answer she was willing to speak aloud. I had not, she said deliberately, finalized my arrangements. You have no arrangements. I have the beginnings of arrangements. Miss Oakhurst. Your Grace. He regarded her. She regarded him. The fire settled, sending up a small cascade of sparks. It would be impractical, he said slowly, to dismiss a caretaker who has demonstrably managed this property with competence on the same day I arrive. Something flickered in her expression, quickly suppressed. That is, a pragmatic observation, Your Grace. I am on occasion pragmatic. He rose from the chair. He did it carefully, as he still had to, as he would always have to now. His left leg had healed badly and reminded him of it with grinding regularity, and moved to the window. Outside, the garden was already dim in the failing light, but he could see what she had done with it. The beds, the paths relaid, the roses along the wall. You will remain, he said, until we have determined a suitable arrangement. And what arrangement did you have in mind? He turned to look at her over his shoulder. She had not moved. She stood exactly as she had before, shoulders back, hands clasped at her waist, the book still held loosely in her right hand. But there was something in the line of her jaw, something almost imperceptibly taut, that told him she was considerably less certain than she appeared. Good. He was considerably less certain than he appeared, too. I haven't the faintest idea, he said honestly. I have been away for years. I arrived home 2 hours ago to discover my estate has been managed by a woman I have never met, and that she has reorganized my library. A beat. Was the original system truly incomprehensible? He asked. The question surprised her. He saw it. A small disruption in her composure, there and gone in an instant. Profoundly, she said. And because he had not laughed in a very long time, the sound that came out of him was rusty and brief, and entirely unexpected. More like a cough than a laugh, but present nonetheless. Christiana blinked. He turned back to the window, before she could see whatever was happening to his face. Dinner, he said. 7 o'clock. You will join me. He paused. If you have been managing this household, I imagine you have more information about its current state than I do. It is a practical necessity. Of course, she said, evenly. A practical necessity. Yes. Then I will see you at 7, Your Grace. He heard her leave. The soft sound of her slippers on the floorboards retreating toward the east wing growing fainter. He listened until the manor settled back into its quiet, and then he let out a breath that had been waiting too long. Outside, the first star appeared over Somersetshire. He had not looked at a star in months. In the war, stars meant navigation, cold, functional, stripped of anything resembling wonder. He had forgotten, somewhere across the channel, that they could simply be stars. He looked at this one for a long time. She had set the table herself. He noticed this the moment he entered the dining room at 7. Not because the setting was imperfect, but because it was too deliberate. There were no footmen. The staff, as she had explained, had been reduced to Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, and a girl from the village who came 3 mornings a week. Christiana had placed the candles herself, spacing them with the methodical geometry of someone who finds order soothing. 2 places, facing each other across the corner of the long mahogany table, rather than at the formal ends. A pragmatic choice, she would undoubtedly say. He sat across from her and noted that she had changed her dress. It was still modest, a soft grey wool high at the neck, nothing that would raise an eyebrow in the strictest drawing room in London. But she had repinned her hair, and the candlelight found the dark warmth in it, and Thaddeus looked at his soup and decided he was simply hungry from the journey. "The kitchen garden," he said as Mrs. Holt left them. "You mentioned replanting it." "Yes." She reached for her water glass with the deliberate movement of someone who was going to keep this dinner orderly by sheer force of will. "The original beds had been left through 2 winters. I salvaged the rosemary and the thyme, they are remarkably stubborn plants, and added leeks, parsnips, and 2 beds of early greens. The strawberries are the east bed. They should come in well by June." He looked at her. "You planned for June," he said. She met his gaze steadily. Someone had to plan for June. The candlelight moved between them. He looked away first, back at his soup, which was good, simple but well made, the broth clean and deep. "You cook," he said. "On occasion. Mrs. Holt manages the principal meals. I assist when I am able." A pause. "I find it useful to do something with my hands." He understood that precisely and completely, in a way he had not expected to understand anything this evening. The need to do something with your hands when your mind will not cooperate. The specific mercy of a task that requires only your body and not your thoughts. The months abroad had taught him that. The soldiers who survived best were the ones who could always find something to mend, to build, to tend. "The peninsula," she said, not quite a question, but not entirely a statement. He looked up. Her expression was measured. Not pitying. He could not have borne pity. Something more considered than that. The attentiveness of someone who has decided that asking directly is more respectful than circling. "Years of it," he said simply. She nodded. "My cousin was at Salamanca." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. He understood what that meant. He had been at Salamanca too. He had walked that ground the morning after in the particular silence of aftermath, when the only sounds were the kind no man forgets. "He came home," she said quietly, "but not quite the same." "No," said Thaddeus. "One does not." The candles breathed between them. Outside, the wind moved through the new leaves in the garden, her garden technically, though he was no longer certain what was his and what was hers in this house. The lines had blurred in the hours since his arrival, and he was not sure when that had happened or whether to be troubled by it. "The library," he said, because he needed to move away from Salamanca. "How did you reorganize it?" A small exhale, release perhaps of tension held for some other reason. "By subject primarily. Your predecessor, I assume it was your predecessor, had arranged everything chronologically by acquisition, which meant a Latin herbal was shelved beside a restoration comedy, beside a volume on hydraulic engineering, in sequence only because they arrived in the same fortnight. It does sound like my grandfather. I separated the natural philosophy, the history, the literature, and the law. The travel volumes have their own section now. There were more than I expected. Someone in your family was very interested in the Ottoman Empire. My great-uncle. He spent 4 years in Constantinople and never quite recovered from it. I found his journals." She glanced up. "I did not read them," she added quickly. "I wouldn't have minded if you had." The words came out before he had decided to say them. She heard the surprise in his own voice. He knew she had because something shifted in her expression, that poised composure bending fractionally toward something less guarded. "You have been very alone here," he said. It was not quite a question, a pause, a very small one, but present. "I have been very busy," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "That is not the same thing." Her fingers rested lightly on the stem of her glass. She did not answer immediately, and he did not press her. He had learned long ago that the silences a person chooses to hold are often the most important things about them. "No," she said finally. "It isn't." The admission was quiet and unembellished, and it cost her something. He could see that in the way she returned her attention to her plate immediately after, the slight squaring of her shoulders that was the physical posture of a woman putting something back where she had taken it from. He had been alone too, in a different way, surrounded by men, by noise, by the relentless logistics of campaigns, and entirely alone in the place where aloneness actually lives. He recognized it in her the way a person recognizes a landscape they have traveled in different weather. They finished dinner, speaking of easier things, the state of the roof. 2 tiles on the east side required attention. The condition of the stables. She had kept 1 horse, a sensible grey gelding named Ptolemy, for necessity. The village, smaller than he remembered, but recovering, she thought, from the hard winter. She knew his estate better than he did. He did not find this as uncomfortable as he might have expected. When she rose to leave, "Good night, Your Grace." She paused at the door. "Your room," she said. "The master suite. I had Mrs. Holt air it this afternoon, and have the fire lit. It was—" She stopped, began again. "It has been kept. The room, I mean. I made sure of it. I thought someone ought to." He looked at her across the length of the dining room. In the candlelight she was very still, and her expression held something he could not yet name, something between guarded and tender, too layered for a single word. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once, dipped her chin, and was gone. He sat alone at the table for a long time after. The candles burned down slowly. Outside, his garden, her garden, moved quietly in the April dark. He slept badly, as he always did. This was not new. Sleep had become a negotiation since the war ended, a territory he entered with caution and exited without warning, dragged back to wakefulness by sounds that existed only in his memory, by the particular kind of darkness that carries the smell of smoke, even when there is no smoke for miles. He had learned to manage it. He rose at 5, dressed in the pre-dawn quiet, and went downstairs to find that someone had already banked the kitchen fire. Christiana was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a piece of paper covered in small, neat handwriting. She looked up without surprise. "You rise early," he said. "I always have." She gestured with faint formality toward the teapot on the trivet. "I hope you do not object to the kitchen. The breakfast room is strictly speaking functional, but the kitchen is warm." He poured himself tea and sat down across from her, because the kitchen was warm and the alternative was the breakfast room alone. She returned to her paper. He looked at it. "Accounts?" he asked. "The quarterly household record." She turned it so he could see, columns of figures, everything neat and annotated in her small handwriting, every expenditure explained. Candles, coal, Mrs. Holt's wages, the chimney sweep, Ptolemy's feed and shoeing. He looked at the numbers for a long moment. Everything was accounted for, down to the last penny. Not with the defensive thoroughness of someone who feared scrutiny, with the quiet, unshakable discipline of someone who had learned that order and care were the same thing, that to account for something was to protect it. "This is 3 years of records," he said. 18 months, from when I arrived." She turned the page. "Before that, I have only Mr. Prentice's notes, which are, well, you have met Mr. Prentice's correspondence. Incomplete." "Imaginative," she said, which was the most damning word she could apparently bring herself to use. He looked up from the accounts to find her watching him with that same measured assessment she had turned on him in the library, direct, unhurried. The kind of look that most women in his experience had been trained out of, that particular directness, that willingness to look at a man and see him plainly rather than performing the elaborate social theatre of not quite looking. He did not, he discovered, dislike being seen. That was new. "You are thinking about something," she said. "I frequently think about things. It is a difficult habit to break." The ghost of something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but its precursor. "I meant specifically," she said. "You are thinking about something and have decided not to say it. Is that different from ordinary thinking? In men of your temperament?" "Considerably." He set down his cup. You have known me for less than 12 hours. I have been living in your house for 18 months, she said evenly. I know what books you read, what hours you keep by implication, that you commissioned 3 portraits of the same grey horse at different stages of its life, which is either eccentric or devoted, and I have not decided which, and that you kept every letter your mother ever wrote to you in a box in the library and have not opened it since her death. The silence was absolute. He was very still. She held his gaze, and he saw it then, the faint tension at the corner of her mouth, the awareness that she had gone further than she intended, further than was strictly proper, further than the steady distance she had been maintaining since his arrival. I didn't, she began. No, he said. You're right. He looked at his tea. His mother had died while he was in the field. He had received the letter 3 weeks after the fact, in a farmhouse outside Salamanca, and had read it behind the house, alone, and had not spoken of it to anyone since. He had not been able to go home for the funeral. He had not been able to go home for anything. There had only been the front and the mud and the next engagement after that. He had come home to find someone had cared for the things he had left. The box, he said. Did you put it in the library? A pause. It was in the drawing room beside the window. I thought it should be somewhere it was less exposed. She hesitated. I didn't mean to overreach. You didn't. A quality of quiet settled between them, not uncomfortable, not the sharp-edged silence of the evening before, but something different, something that required neither of them to speak in order to be present. Outside, the birds had begun. She gathered her accounts into a neat pile and rose to refill the teapot, moving around the kitchen with the easy efficiency of someone fully at home. He watched her, the practiced certainty of her movements, the way she knew where everything was without looking, the small unconscious habits of a person who has lived alone and learned to need nothing from anyone because there has been no one to provide it. He recognized that too. Christiana, he said, and then stopped because he had not meant to use her given name and could not account for the fact that he had. She turned from the stove, did not correct him. Her expression was unreadable, or perhaps simply too layered for him to read in his current condition. What did you intend to say? She asked. He thought about it for a moment, honestly thought about it, turned the words over, measured them. I don't know yet, he admitted. She held his gaze for one long, unhurried moment. Then she nodded, one small accepting nod, as if I don't know yet was a perfectly sufficient answer, as if she had long since made her peace with the unfinished and the unresolved. She set the teapot back on the trivet and returned to her seat. They finished their tea in the particular silence of 2 people who have said more than they intended, and are not sorry for it. The morning was dry for the first time since his arrival. Thaddeus went to the stables after breakfast, because a man who has spent years sleeping in fields and making decisions by the hour needs occasionally the uncomplicated company of animals. Ptolemy, the sensible grey gelding, her horse, technically, regarded him from his stall with the supremely indifferent intelligence of a horse that has decided all humans are largely the same and can be assessed and dismissed within 30 seconds. Thaddeus gave him an apple from the kitchen bowl and scratched his nose, and Ptolemy accepted this tribute with dignified condescension. He heard her before she reached the stable door, a particular cadence of footsteps he had, without intending to, already begun to recognize. She stopped when she saw him. He doesn't like strangers, she said, and then immediately revised. He doesn't usually like strangers. We came to an arrangement. Thaddeus stepped back from the stall. I offered tribute. He accepted it with great reluctance. A small line appeared at the corner of her mouth, that not quite smile again, deployed like a controlled thing. I was going to the garden, she said. There are things that need doing before the rain returns. He walked with her. He did not ask if he could. She did not invite him. They simply moved toward the garden together, as if the arrangement had been established by some prior negotiation neither of them could quite remember. The garden was extraordinary, he understood now, in the full morning light. Not the formal gardens, those he vaguely recalled from childhood, the manicured hedges and gravel walks that had been maintained by a staff of 4 and expressed primarily a kind of aggressive botanical discipline. Those had been reduced in the years since to their bare bones, and she had not attempted to restore them in their original grandeur. She had done something more interesting. She had planted for use and for beauty in equal parts, and allowed the two to blur. The kitchen beds ran along the south wall, dense and purposeful, but bordered with marigolds she said kept the aphids away, and their orange brightness against the old stone wall was involuntary, essential, entirely unnecessary and entirely right. The roses along the eastern face had been encouraged, not merely tolerated. There was a small bench he did not remember, half hidden between an old yew and a new planting of lavender, positioned to catch the afternoon sun. He stopped at the bench. "You put this here," he said. It was in the old potting shed. She was already kneeling in the first bed, gloved hands moving through the soil with practiced efficiency. The wood was sound. It needed only cleaning and a new coat of oil. He sat on the bench. She worked. For a while he simply watched, the movement of her hands through dark soil, the small continuous concentration of her expression.
I came back empty, with war in my bones, a house full of echoes that wasn't my home. No light in the windows, no voice in the air, just ghosts in the hallway, and no one there. But something was different, something had changed. I found you in my silence, where I thought nothing could.
The way she pulled a weed with the particular satisfaction of a person who has found a task exactly proportionate to their energy, methodical, absorbed, at ease. She was most herself, he noticed, when she was doing something. "You must have been very frightened," he said, "when I arrived." Her hands paused, only for a moment. "I was calculating," she said. "There is a difference." "What were you calculating?" She sat back on her heels, looking at the bed rather than at him. "Whether you were likely to be reasonable." A pause. "The portraits in the hall were not especially helpful in that determination. You look considerably more approachable in person than in oils." The painter was deeply pessimistic. He captured the jawline accurately, at least. He looked at her, and she looked at the garden, and the lavender moved between them in the faint spring wind. "And have I been?" he asked. "Reasonable." She was quiet for a moment, genuinely considering it, not performing consideration. "You have been," she said deliberately. "Unexpected." "That is not the same as reasonable." "No," she said. "It isn't." And this time she turned and looked at him directly, and the not-quite smile was almost a real one. "But I find I prefer it." He held her gaze, and something happened, one of those moments that has no drama in it, no sound or movement or visible change, but in which a line is crossed that cannot quite be uncrossed. He felt it as clearly as he had felt the particular moment in battle when everything becomes very simple, when the noise drops away and only the essential things remain, perfectly sharp, perfectly present. He looked away first. "Tell me about the strawberries," he said. She blinked, a small human surprise, and then she laughed. Not the guarded, almost smile. An actual laugh, brief and genuine, breaking the surface of her reserve like light through cloud. It was over in a moment, but it stayed in the air between them, and in the warm morning silence of the garden with the smell of good soil and lavender and old stone, Thaddeus felt something in his chest loosen, some tight, long-held thing releasing slowly, like a fist unclenching after years. "The east bed," she said, composing herself, and he heard the thread of warmth still in her voice. "I planted them last autumn. They should give fruit by June," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. He met her gaze. "I plan to be here in June," he said simply. Her hands moved back to the soil, and he thought he saw, though she had turned away before he could be certain, the private, unguarded expression of a woman who had been given something small and had not known she wanted it until this moment. The letter arrived on Thursday. Thaddeus was in the study when Graves brought it in, the study he had not yet properly reclaimed, that still carried the slight particular atmosphere of having been recently and respectfully tended by someone who was not its owner. The pen tray was clean. the inkwell full. He had found the first morning a small note in Christiana's handwriting folded beside the account books. The desk lamp wick should be replaced. I have left a new one in the right drawer. It had been there. He had replaced it and had sat at the desk feeling obscurely taken care of, which was unsettling and not unwelcome. He broke the seal. It was from his solicitor in London, Weatherby, a more competent man than Prentice, who wrote in the clean, direct style of someone who respects their client's time. The letter concerned two things: the formal accounting of the estate's debts, incurred during his long absence, which were manageable, and a second matter that occupied the final paragraph. Thaddeus read the final paragraph 3 times. Then he set the letter down on the desk and sat very still. There had been, Weatherby informed him, considerable discussion among the relevant families during his time away, specifically the families of the young ladies who had been, the word used was considered, which was the particular social vocabulary for what had actually been intensive parental negotiation, for the position of Duchess of Ashcroft prior to the Duke's departure. With his return now confirmed, said families were naturally renewing their interest. Weatherby had taken the liberty of noting that the season was well underway in London, and that the Duke's presence at any number of forthcoming events would be... He folded the letter. He stood up from the desk and went to the window. Outside in the garden, Christiana was cutting the first roses of the year, carefully with the small pruning knife she kept in the pocket of her apron, selecting each stem with the attentiveness of a woman who understands that cutting at the right place is what makes growth possible. She had a small basket over one arm. Her dark hair was coming down again, as it always did by midday, and she didn't bother with it. He watched her for longer than was strictly necessary. The season, London, the drawing rooms and ballrooms, and the careful parade of eligible women whose primary qualification was their bloodline and their willingness to accept a man they barely knew as the organizing principle of their existence. He had been that man once, younger, less scarred, still able to move through those rooms with the ease of someone who has never questioned whether he belongs. He was not sure he was that man now. He went to the garden. She heard him coming. She always did. She was very attuned to the sounds of the house, to its rhythms, the way a person becomes attuned to the rhythms of a place they have guarded alone. "You look," she said, without looking up from her roses, "as if you have received bad news." "Not bad," he said. "Complicated." She snipped a stem, placed it in the basket. "Would you like to talk about it, or would you prefer to pace silently near the lavender until you have sorted it yourself?" "I'm not pacing. You're standing in the lavender," she said. "It is a preliminary stage." He looked down. He was, in fact, standing in the lavender. He stepped out of the lavender. She finally looked up at him, and whatever she saw in his face made the brisk efficiency of her expression soften, fractionally, toward something more open. "Tell me," she said simply. He told her. Not all of it. Not the feeling that had been building in him since the first morning, since the library, since the bench in the garden, since her laugh in the April sunlight. But the practical substance. London. The season. The expectation that had been waiting for him, patient and inevitable as a scheduled engagement, for the years he had been too far away to be compelled by it. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning the pruning knife slowly in her gloved hand, looking at the basket of roses. "And is there," she said deliberately, "a particular candidate the families have in mind?" "Several, I believe." "Ah." The word was very small, very controlled. He looked at her, really looked with the kind of attention he had been trying with diminishing success to withhold since Thursday morning in the kitchen. He watched the line of her jaw tighten slightly and then deliberately release. He watched her hand still on the knife. He watched her gather herself with the practiced quiet of a woman who has been doing exactly that in difficult moments for a very long time. "Christiana," he said. "You should go," she said, not unkindly. "To London, I mean. It is unexpected. It is what is required of you." She looked up, and her eyes were very steady, and there was something behind that steadiness that he recognized because he felt the same thing, something guarded and contained and quietly desperate. "I will manage the house while you are away, as I have done." "I know you will." "Then we are agreed." "We are not agreed," he said. She blinked. He had not meant to say it quite that way, flatly, immediately, with no prelude, but the words had come out with the absolute certainty of a man who spent years at the front learning which things could wait and which could not. She stared at him. The roses were between them, the lavender, the warm afternoon light falling through the old stone of the garden walls. "Thaddeus," she said, his name for the first time, and then stopped, as if she had surprised herself with it. He took one step forward, and then stopped, because the distance between them was not merely physical, and he understood that. She was a woman without protection, without a family that claimed her, in a house that belonged to him, in a position that was already impossible by every social measure that governed her world. To step over that distance without the proper weight behind the step, without the word that made it mean what he intended it to mean, would be to do precisely the kind of harm that the quiet architecture of her self-possession had been built to prevent. He would not do that to her. He held his ground. "I have no intention," he said quietly, "of going to London to find a duchess." The pause was very long. "Your Grace, I have been home for 5 days," he said, "and I have been, May, for the first time since before I left England. Something other than simply a man surviving." He looked at her directly. "I believe you know what I mean by that." Her eyes were very bright. She looked away. "The roses need water," she said, in a voice that was almost steady. "Yes," he said. "They do." He stayed in the garden until the light failed. He did not go to London. He wrote to Weatherby instead, a short letter in his own hand which said simply that he had returned to find his estate required his attention and that the London engagements would need to be deferred. He sealed it before he could reconsider and gave it to Graves, who did not comment because Graves had not commented on anything pertinent since 1811 and was not about to begin now. 3 days passed. They were not 3 easy days. They were 3 days of a particular exquisite tension, the kind that grows when 2 people have said too much and not enough, and are living in the space between. He was aware of her, always, not with the abstract awareness of a landlord conscious of a tenant, but with the acute, inconvenient awareness of someone whose attention has been claimed by a specific other person and refuses to be redirected. He heard her in the library in the mornings. He heard her voice in the kitchen, low and unhurried, giving Mrs. Holt the day's instructions. He heard the particular sound of her footsteps on the upper landing at night, returning from the east wing. She kept different hours than him later to retire, and he had learned the pattern of them without meaning to. He admitted to himself on the 3rd evening, sitting in the library with a book he had not read a word of, in an entirely undignified condition for a man of his rank and experience. He was afraid. Not of battle. He had made his accommodation with that particular fear long ago, and it no longer governed him. He was afraid of something quieter and more permanent. He was afraid of want. He had not allowed himself to want something since before the crossing, because wanting things in the field was a liability, an open wound that circumstance could find and use. He had sealed himself against it. He had been very efficient about it. She had in 5 days entirely undone his efficiency. He found her in the small sitting room off the library, a room he had barely registered as a room before this week. That had been, he was now certain, entirely unloved under his grandfather's regime, and that she had turned into something warm and inhabitable. 2 good chairs angled toward the fire, a writing desk by the window, a small bookshelf with a collection that was clearly hers rather than the household's, organized by some principle he had not yet deciphered. She was writing a letter. She looked up when he entered, and he saw her take in whatever his face was doing. She was very good at reading faces, this woman. She had watched him long enough to know him better than she perhaps intended to, and he had watched her long enough to know when she was doing it. She set down her pen. "Thaddeus," she said. "You use my name now," he said. He was aware this was not the beginning of the conversation he had planned, but the conversation he had planned had departed him entirely. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace?" "Don't." He crossed the room, carefully as always, and sat down in the chair across from her. The fire was between them. "I prefer it." She was very still. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I would ask you to let me finish before you argue with me, because I have been composing this since Tuesday morning in the kitchen, and I would like to have said it before I lose my nerve entirely, which is, I recognize, an embarrassing thing to admit, but there it is." She blinked. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her knuckles were white again, that particular whiteness that told him she was not as unshakable as she appeared. "I don't know," he said, "what this estate was before you came to it. I was not here. I know what it is now. I have walked every room. I have sat in this chair by this fire. I have stood in that garden and seen what you have grown in my absence, and I know what it is now. It is a home." He paused. "I do not use that word lightly. I have not had occasion to use it in any meaning that held for some time." "Thaddeus, let me finish," he said gently. She closed her mouth. "I have no interest," he said, "in going to London to find a woman I do not know to make my duchess, because I have been home for 8 days, and I have had more conversation that matters, more actual conversation, more actual understanding, with you, in this room, in that kitchen, in the garden, than I have had with anyone since before I left England." He looked at her steadily. "I understand if the situation is impossible. I understand the position you are in, the questions it raises, the things the world will say. I am asking you to let me address those things, properly, correctly, in the way that protects you rather than compromising you." He paused. "I am asking, Christiana, if you will permit me to court you." The fire made its small, living sounds. She was very still. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the firelight, and she was fighting something. He could see it in the rigid line of her spine, the hard-held steadiness of a woman who has learned that hope is a dangerous thing and cannot simply unlatch the door to it on 8 days' acquaintance, no matter what those 8 days contained. "You are a duke," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "Yes. And I have nothing. No estate, no family of consequence, no portion that would satisfy any reasonable expectation for a woman in your—" "I don't care about any of that," he said. "You should." "I'm aware that I should," he said. "I find I am unable to manage it." A sound escaped her, small, involuntary, something between a laugh and its opposite. "You are," she said, "a deeply inconvenient man." "I am," he agreed. "I have been told." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and in the firelight the careful architecture of her self-possession finally, quietly, let something through. Something he recognized as the particular look of a person who has stopped pretending they do not want what they want. It was not dramatic. There was no visible breaking, no tears, no trembling, just a shift, barely perceptible, in the way she held herself, the line of her shoulders released by a fraction. The set of her mouth softened. She breathed in, slowly, all the way down, and breathed out, and in that exhale something she had been holding for a very long time went with it. "I set the table that first night," she said, her voice quieter now, stripped of its usual brisk composure. "At the corner, not at the formal ends. Because I—" She stopped. "Because you what?" "Because I wanted it to feel like a conversation," she said, "not a performance." He understood that perfectly. He understood it in every part of himself that the years abroad had stripped bare and left honest. The part that had forgotten how to perform anything, that had only the blunt and unadorned truth left to offer. "Then let us have a conversation," he said, "for as long as it takes, properly, carefully, with all the required formalities which I will attend to with great thoroughness, because you deserve great thoroughness." She held his gaze for a long moment. The fire settled. A log shifted, sending up a brief constellation of sparks that rose and vanished in the dark above the grate. "Yes," she said. It was one word. It contained everything. He did not move toward her. She did not move toward him. The fire burned between them, and the small sitting room held its breath, and outside the window the Somersetshire night was soft and limitless, and full of the smell of new grass and turned earth, and the distant sweetness of the first roses opening along the eastern wall. He thought of the first evening, the smoke curling from the chimney as the carriage came up the drive, that impossible domestic ribbon of grey against the pewter sky. The thing that had unsettled him. The thing that had, without his knowing it, already begun to undo him. She had lit that fire not knowing he was coming. She had lit it because it was cold, and the house needed warmth, and she was the kind of person who did not wait to be asked to do the necessary thing. That was who she was. Not merely in the grand gestures, but in the small, unremarkable ones. The straightened portrait, the replaced wick, the bench pulled from the potting shed and set where the afternoon light could find it. She had been tending this place, tending it faithfully, alone, without recognition or thanks, for 18 months, and in doing so, without knowing it, she had been tending something for him. "Christiana," he said. She looked at him. "The box," he said. "My mother's letters. I should like to read them, I think—" He paused, and there was something honest and difficult in the pause, the kind of difficulty that is not weakness, but its opposite, the courage to say the thing plainly. "I think I was not ready before, to read them, to be here in this house and feel what it would mean to be here." He looked at the fire. "I believe I am ready now." She was quiet for a moment. "I will get it for you," she said, and rose. She moved to the small bookshelf. He watched her hand go directly to the lower shelf, third from the left without hesitation, and drew out the box. It was plain dark wood, not large. She held it for a moment with both hands, looking at it with an expression he could not fully read. Something private and careful and very gentle. She crossed to him and held it out. He took it. Their fingers did not touch, but the exchange was intimate in the way of things that carry weight. He felt the smallness of the box in his hands, the particular lightness of it, and beneath that the enormous gravity of what it held. "Thank you," he said. She returned to her chair. She did not leave, and he did not ask her to. He held the box in his lap for a long time without opening it. The fire burned. The night pressed softly against the windows. At some point she picked up her letter again, not to write, just to hold, and the room settled into the kind of quiet that is not empty but full, the kind of quiet that belongs to people who have found they can exist in the same space without needing to fill it. He did not open the box that night, but he held it. And that, for now, was enough. When he finally rose to go, it was past 11. He had not noticed the hours passing, which was new. In the field, the hours were everything, the clock a constant presence pressing at the back of the skull. Here they had simply moved, unremarked, the way time moves in rooms where something real is happening. She rose when he did. They stood facing each other in the small room, and the candle on her writing desk was burning low, and the shadows were long and warm, and the distance between them was both very small and very understood. "Good night, Thaddeus," she said. "Not your grace. Just his name. Steady and quiet, and entirely her own." Something moved in his chest, that loosening again, that slow unclenching, the specific and unfamiliar sensation of a man who is, against all expectation, beginning to heal. "Good night, Christiana," he said. He left her there with her low candle and her letter, and the fire dying down to embers, and he climbed the stairs to the room she had kept for him, the room that smelled of beeswax and aired linen, and the particular warmth of a hearth someone had thought to light, and he sat on the edge of the bed with his mother's box in his hands, and he listened to the house settle around him. It breathed. Halcourt Manor breathed, the way a living thing breathes, the slow tick of cooling stone, the faint creak of old timber, the distant murmur of wind finding its way through the garden she had planted and tended and brought back to life. He opened the box. The first letter was dated April 1808, 6 years ago. His mother's handwriting, small and slanted, the ink slightly faded, filled the page. "My dear Thaddeus," it began, "the roses on the east wall have come in rather well this year, and I find myself thinking you would have liked to see them." He read until the candle guttered. Outside, in the garden below the master window, the first strawberries were small and green and full of unreasonable promise. June was coming. He would be here. So would she. That's where we leave them. Not at the ending, but at the beginning of something real. Something built slowly and carefully, like a garden in a house that had forgotten what warmth felt like. If this story stayed with you, if you felt Christiana and Thaddeus the way we hope you did, subscribe and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? We read every single one.
I came back empty, with war in my bones, a house full of echoes that wasn't my home. No light in the windows, no voice in the air, just ghosts in the hallway, and no one there. But something was different, something had changed. I found you in my silence, where I thought nothing could grow. In the space I had buried, you gave life to the cold. You were there in the quiet, in the fire I didn't light. And without even knowing, you brought me back to life. You moved like you belonged there, like time had been kind, fixing what I abandoned without asking why. No crown, no title, no reason to stay, but you held every broken piece I threw away. I didn't come back looking, I didn't believe I could feel, but somewhere between your voice and the garden, you made something real. I found you in my silence, in the war I couldn't leave. You were never the stranger, you were home.